Thank you very much for joining me, giving it up your lunchtime. If you're in Sydney, New South Wales, Australia, or otherwise your early afternoon tea for this afternoon to spend some time with me on this topic of co-founder magic. I'm My-Linh and this is Term Sheet Guru. Being a lawyer, I do have to give you the usual disclaimer that, of course, this is not legal or financial advice. It's general information for educational and information purposes only. I'd like to tell you a little bit about me before we get started. I come from a family of entrepreneurs, which is almost out of necessity as my family came to Australia as immigrants in the 80s. I started my first business when I was 5 years old, and I was setting up a market stall in my cousin's garage, and I was selling old toys to the kids in my neighborhood. But being a first generation immigrant, I of course was encouraged by my parents to get a university degree. And because I loved to negotiate, and my parents used to describe me as being argumentative, but my teachers described me as being a good debater. So because I loved to negotiate, I ended up considering and studying law, and I became a lawyer. But the calling of building a business was always a calling out to me. And eventually I started to set up my own businesses, and I've started and sold out a number of tech startups as well as businesses along the way. I've been advising startups in a legal capacity for almost 20 years. And I've helped startups raise over $300 million in that time. I've worked in big law, in-house in corporates. I've worked in Europe and in Asia. But I had an experience when I came back to Australia in about 2012, which changed the trajectory of my career. I was helping a friend with his marketing startup, not in official legal capacity. He was working with a mid-sized law firm, some law firm that you would have heard of if I mentioned the name, and they were negotiating a tech contract. The lawyers had gone back and forth almost 20 times with the other side to get this contract over the line. And I said to him, look, can I have a go at this? I'll pick up the phone and I'll talk to the other side. So that's what I ended up doing, and we ended up closing the deal. That's when it occurred to me that I could help make more of an impact for startups by providing a boutique service where I could be involved in making sure deals get closed, rather than sitting in a larger law firm when the incentive is always to delegate to the most junior person possible. And that's how Metis Law was born. And Term Sheet Guru is our product designed specifically for early stage startups to help them raise capital faster and successfully. I've been in the trenches of raising capital myself as a founder and as an advisor. And this particular topic about co-founders is very close to my heart because I've been a co-founder and I've had a business go very awry with some co-founders, and I'll share a little bit about that with you later if we have some time. So I've got the scars, the battle wounds, and of course the learnings with my clients to share with you today. We've got lots on our agenda today, and at the end we'll have a quiz. We'll be giving away 3 tickets to our term sheet negotiation masterclass in October, where you'll learn negotiation skills and walk away with an investor-ready term sheet for your next cap raise. So if you want to be in the running for that, follow us on our Term Sheet Guru Facebook page, and Tony's going to put a link to that in the chat, and we'll get to that at the end for the quiz and the prize. Thanks for sharing that link, Tony. Before I dive in, I'd like to learn about you. So tell me a little bit about yourself so I can customize my chat today to your particular situation. So Tony's going to put up a couple of questions, a poll for you. The first one is, which one describes you the best? You have co-founders, you're looking for co-founders, but you haven't found any prospects. You have prospective founders, you're looking at leaving a co-founder relationship or other. And the second question is, what stage of business are you at? You haven't launched yet. You've launched, you're in the startup phase with no or some revenue. You're scaling up, so you're growing, or you're looking for an exit in the next 12 to 24 months or something else. And a couple of those might apply to you, but which is most relevant? We'll give you about a minute to answer those questions. So which one best describes you, and what stage of business are you at? How are we going there, Tony?
So far we've got 10 responses. So
just waiting for a few more people.
Yep.
Okay, let's just close that off there. What have we got?
Okay.
Great. So if you have co-founders, looking for co-founders, or have prospective co-founders, and some are looking to leave. Great. So a lot of early stage startups here today. Fantastic. Thank you for that. So for our early stage startups and those of you who are looking for co-founders or looking to vet your co-founders, why does this even matter? Why is this conversation even relevant? So many of you might have seen this statistic before. 40 to 50% of first marriages end in divorce, and 60 to 65% of second marriages end in divorce. Now, these are frightening figures, but we are quite familiar with them. But what if I told you that going into business with someone is like getting married to them, and you'll spend more waking hours with your co-founder than you will with your partner or your spouse, and certainly more time with them than you will with your children. You'll likely build a more valuable asset with a co-founder than you will anywhere else. But the reality is this: 100% of co-founder relationships will end. How that happens and what that end looks like will vary. It can be an exit. Someone buys your company for, say, a 10-time multiple. That's great. But in most cases, it's going to be something less idyllic. For example, someone leaves the business because their family situation changes. They run out of money, they get sick. So there will be a breakup or a separation in 100% of cases. And the thing is, we're all human, right? So despite our best intentions, when the relationship ends, at least one person will get hurt or emotional due to the breakup. And because of this, things can and do often get nasty. So being prepared, like coming today, getting this sort of information and preparing yourself and your startup, talking through the hard issues with your co-founder now will make that breakup process, which is bound to happen, much, much easier. And if there's one thing that I'd like you to take away from today's webinar, it is to document everything. And this is not only in the form of co-founder agreements, but the processes that you go through when you're vetting your co-founder, making plans with your co-founder. And I'll break this down and you'll see why it's necessary to do that as we go through today's talk. At Term Sheet Guru, I like to talk about the 3 pillars of raising capital successfully, because at the end of the day, most startups come to us because they want to raise capital in order to launch and scale their business. And we talk about the 3 distinct phases of capital raising: seed, sprout, and grow. And I won't go into this in much detail today, other than to say that this process that you're going through with your co-founder, your prospective co-founder, to vet them and set up goals, starts in or sits in the seed phase under building your data room, because when you start your cap raising, you will be required to put information in there about your co-founder arrangements. I'd like to tell you a story about Alex, a founder that we worked with. In December 2019, now you might remember, it was the summer of 2019, bushfires were raging across New South Wales in Australia. Donald Trump had just been impeached for the first time, and Alex was sitting in her share house in Marrickville in Sydney's inner west, sweltering in the heat. And she was working on what was her second startup in 3 years. This time, she was trying to solve a problem that she and her 75-year-old mother, who was living by herself with her yappy little schnauzer, were struggling with. And this problem was how to keep power costs down, particularly with the increasing heat of Sydney summers each year. Now, Alex was a coder. She had taught herself how to code when she was in school, and she'd built a couple of apps herself. But her previous experience in startups was as a sole founder. She knew that in order to really make a crack at it this time, she'd need some help with sales, marketing, the product size, and relationships. But the thought of bringing on someone into something that she had come up with and she had created was, of course, really scary. Alex started talking to family and friends, and she also tried a few founder platforms where they could match her up with people. Some of them use AI to do that. She went to a few pitch nights to date co-founders. Over the course of about 3 months, she was introduced to the following people. Firstly, there was Adam. She and Adam had actually worked together in corporate previously. He was a real numbers guy. He'd managed a team. He worked on and managed complex projects, and he was a really charismatic presenter. There was Sophie. Sophie was a marketing expert, and Alex had actually engaged her previously to work in one of her other startups. Sophie had experience in customer development and had developed great partnerships in her own business. There was Dan. Dan was a sales consultant, and he played in a band with Alex's partner. And then there was Max. Max was an engineer. He was introduced by a friend from school, and he had experience managing projects. In the end, she decided to consider these 4 as potential co-founders. At the time Alex came to see us, at the time, Alex hadn't come to see us yet, but if she had, we would have told her that the first question for her to consider was whether these people actually should be founders or should they just be an employee. So this is what we refer to as the founder checklist. Questions that Alex and startup founders should ask themselves to determine whether someone ought to be a founder or they're better off as an employee. The first is perception. Now, is this person, in the eyes of the other founders, should they be a founder? And this can be a hard question to ask when you're a sole founder and you're looking for your first founder. But when you have a multiple founder team, this gets easier to answer. Should this person be a founder at all? The second is there an existing relationship between this person with the other co-founders? So in the case of Adam, Sophie, Dan, and Max, they all had existing relationships with Alex. And this question goes to compatibility. So prior history can often help determine your ability to work together moving forward. It can help determine the ability to resolve conflict, to communicate issues, and even to tolerate each other's weird personality and working quirks. Personal runway. Is this person able to work with little or no pay for a long period of time? And this could be 12 to 18 months, even more. This is really important and is often something that stops people from continuing to work in a startup. What is this person's commitment to work? This is a contentious one. And what I mean by work commitment is, will they work full-time or part-time in the business? Now, it's contentious because I know many founders who are serial entrepreneurs, so they'll be working part-time in numerous little projects and they can still have great results. But where co-founders are spouses, for example, or life partners, you'll often see one partner working part-time while the other works full-time. But generally speaking, you would want a co-founder to be working in the business full-time. And if they're not initially working in it full-time, will they transition to full-time, or are they willing to transition to full-time at some point? Commitments around life. So are they willing to give up opportunities in life to focus on working on the startup? So Dan, for example, who plays in a band, if an opportunity came up to go on a gig, would he be willing to give that up in order to focus on the startup? And then finally, of course, skills and experience fit. Does this person's skills fit with those of the other founders? Do they complement or overlap with the other founders? And you'll see that between Adam, Sophie, Dan, and Max, we have quite a complementary skill set. So after doing the founder checklist, Alex decided that Dan and Max weren't founder material, in the sense that the things that they were offering, the skill set that Dan and Max were offering, for example, were things that she could probably employ them to do rather than engage them as a founder. So she shortlisted Adam and Sophie. The next step for Alex was to work out what qualities should she be considering when determining whether or not these particular individuals should be her co-founder for her startup. Now, I won't spend too much time on this, but the areas that you should be asking yourself are, there should be some level of complementary skills and background, because diversity, one, will allow you to have a skill set that spans the depth of and the breadth of the skills required to run a startup. And it also means that you're introducing skills that aren't overlapping too much. There should be complementary operational experience for the same reason. You should have a similar work ethic. If one person ends up working a lot harder than the other person, this is always a cause for disagreement and for resentment. This is a really important one that we see founders overlook when they find or when they meet someone who is highly skilled, highly experienced, has a great reputation, but they're just not a really nice person, or just someone that the founder can't get on with. You need to like this person. You need to like your co-founder, because you're going to spend a hell of a lot of time with them. You need to have shared values. That's an obvious one. And there needs to be an alignment of vision and motives. So are you all working towards the same vision of building a unicorn or building a lifestyle business where you can work in the business part-time? Or does one person want to work part-time and another person want to build a unicorn? Because that's not going to work. Once you've asked yourself that question and worked it out between each person, how do you actually check? My number one tip is nothing actually beats actually working with someone first, even if it's a small project that you pay them to work on. In the case of Alex, she'd worked with both Adam and Sophie in the past. Now, this might not always be possible to work with them first, and that's where share vesting comes in. We'll get to that a bit later. You do, of course, your usual due diligence. You speak to people who know them personally and professionally. You talk, spend lots of time talking with each other, documenting your vision. How do you want the company to run? What do you want the product to look like? Where do you want to be in 5 years' time? And document everything. And the fourth one, which is one that I use and have used when I was looking at co-founding a company, was to have someone you trust interview them. And it doesn't need to be a formal interview. It could be, and in fact, it's better not to be in a formal interview. It's, go out for dinner, go out for drinks, do it multiple times. Someone that you trust can sit down and do that for you. You should, of course, do it as well, but that person can sit down and give you a more objective view. And one really important point that I want to stress is during this process, it's not a one-way street. The commitment that your co-founder is stepping into or potentially stepping into is a big one for them and for you. So encourage them to ask you questions and to vet you. Speak to your referees and people who know you. So because Alex was at the pre-launch stage, she didn't want to spend too much time fussing about titles with her new co-founders. So when it came to splitting responsibilities, she knew that everyone had to get their elbows dirty in all areas of the business. This is how they did it initially. First, they reviewed all their skill sets, experience, and of course, what each person wanted to do in the startup. They then identified what's the goal for our startup. What's the ultimate goal? We want to exit in 7 to 8 years. We want to build as big a company as possible. We want a cap raise. And then they set KPIs for each of Adam and Sophie, and of course for Alex. And of course, document everything. So they didn't have a co-founder agreement, but they wrote these things down. And in fact, they never got around to putting together a co-founder agreement. The other thing to remember is, things to avoid. So don't get hung up on titles, CEO, CFO, COO. Everyone needs to be flexible and make sure that when you're setting KPIs and when you're setting responsibilities, that there is enough built-in flexibility that everyone can roll up their sleeves and do things as and when they need to be done, even if it's not written down in their role description. So don't get hung up on that. When it comes to capital raising, investors will find it easier to work out what each of you are doing if there is a title. So when you get to cap raising, you can give each other titles, but don't get hung up on it. And the second thing to avoid is don't stop checking in, particularly at the early stage. And what I mean by that is you should be constantly communicating with your co-founders. What is everyone at? Where is everyone at in terms of performing against their KPIs? And how are the day-to-day things that they're doing working towards achieving the goals of the startup? Once you've talked about splitting responsibility, the next is splitting equity. Now, this topic can be an entire webinar on its own. So I'll talk about a few key principles. And there are 4 main principles that we believe you should focus on when you're splitting equity. First is be fair. Wrong equity splits, wrong, and I say wrong in inverted commas, can cause issues, especially when things aren't going right. So a fair equity split doesn't mean that everyone has to be equal, but it does mean that there needs to be a good reason that everyone is on board with for the equity splits. So if someone has more than someone else, everyone has to agree that the reason for that is fair. The second one, and I know this is going to be contentious, is that everyone's shares should vest. The principle here is if you're all founders, then you're all in it for the long term and for a larger vision. No one wants a co-founder to leave with a huge chunk of the startup that has not been seen to have been earned, regardless of whether you were the first founder to come on board. And the important thing to remember here is you don't all need to vest equally and at the same time. So if you feel as though in Alex's case, she had worked in the business for 18 months more than anyone else before she brought on her co-founders. So she can vest at a different rate than everybody else. Oh, and set and forget. What I mean by that is once you've come to an agreement on what the split should be, document it and then move on. Don't dwell on it. We've seen too many instances of founders who are constantly obsessing over the equity split after it's been determined, going back, trying to renegotiate things rather than focusing on your business. Your ultimate goal is to create a business that is a more valuable, a bigger pie to share between the co-founders. And then, of course, document everything. Put it into a co-founders agreement. So what's actually fair when it comes to splitting equity? In our view, skills that move the dial should determine how much equity a co-founder gets. And what I mean by this is, are the skills and the contributions that the founder can bring to the table things that can move your startup towards its goal? And the sorts of things that move the dial in a startup are technical expertise. So for example, a CTO, Alex, being able to code. Sales and marketing expertise, of course, without the ability to sell and to market, you're unlikely to grow the startup. Startup leadership and exit experience. So working in a startup is very different to working, say, in a corporate. And we often see people who have corporate experience move into startup roles. And that's great. Having that experience is fantastic. But the nuances of being a leader in a startup and negotiating an exit for a startup is quite different to that of a corporate. Capital raising, if your startup is planning to raise capital, then capital raising experience will help move the dial. Customer development and product and domain expertise. These are sort of the main areas that move the dial. Now, what moves the dial in your particular startup will vary. And so what we do when we look at equity splits is we start off with splitting everyone equally. So in the case of Alex, we would have split into thirds, 33% each. And then we allocate a percentage to each of these skill sets or contributions that move the dial. So for example, technical expertise, we will agree that technical expertise will result in a 10% increase in equity. So we have a scorecard where we then dilute everyone by 10%, but we increase anyone with technical expertise, in this case, Alex, by the 10%. Sales and marketing expertise, we might agree again, it's a 10% increase in equity. So we increase that person by 10%, we reduce everybody else by the aggregate of 10%. And we move through all those skills until we get to a number. And that becomes the equity split. Once that's done, of course, you document it in the form of a co-founder agreement. So that scorecards way of doing it, it's not the only way you can do it. Sometimes you can just pick a number, but the reason why we think it's fair is because you agree upfront that these things are important, these contributions are important, and this is how we quantify that importance. And because you have that scorecard to go back to, it's much easier to justify it as something that is fair. So what do you include in a co-founder agreement? These are the high-level issues that you should be considering in a co-founder agreement. The first is the distribution of value between the founders. So what I'm referring to here are things like equity split, vesting, salary, if anyone's getting paid salary now or in the future. The second is the issue of control. So control in the business. For example, does anyone get a board seat? Do we all get a board seat? Do we have equal voting power as on the board? When can a co-founder be removed as an employee of the business? When can a co-founder be removed as a director? And what happens if a co-founder is not living up to expectations? Management of the business. These are the decisions that affect the day-to-day running of the business. Who's responsible for those decisions, particularly the different aspects of the business? And how are those decisions made? In our experience, the best or most effective way to manage a business is to give one person ultimate decision-making power in relation to their area of expertise. Now, they may be required to consult with the other founders, but the person who has that expertise really is the right person to have the ultimate decision-making, unless it can be unanimous, of course. And then the fourth broad category of term is co-founder exits, because like I said, there's bound to be a co-founder exit. So if a co-founder leaves, what happens to her shares? Does it get bought back by the company? Do the other co-founders get to buy it back? If they buy it back, what value do you attribute to it? And how do you deal with a co-founder's shares if they leave due to illness versus due to doing something wrong? Committing fraud, for example. Should there be any restraints if a co-founder leaves the business, and how long for? And if it turns out that the business is not taking off and you decide to end your startup, can one of the founders take the idea and try again? And if they can, do they need to pay the other co-founders anything for taking that idea and any intellectual property? So all these things need to be documented or should be documented in a co-founder agreement. So I mentioned earlier, Alex actually came to us when things weren't going well. And things weren't going well with Sophie after about 8 to 9 months. The startup had raised a small seed round from family and friends, and they wanted to do an external raise. But in order to do that, they needed to show some traction in their business. Milestones were being missed on the partnership front, which was really Sophie's domain. And this is how we prepared for the negotiations that ensued. Remember all the things that Alex was documenting in her startup? Now, they didn't have a co-founder agreement, but they did document their goals, the KPIs, and the responsibilities. Unfortunately, things got busy, as they do in startups, and they never actually got around to documenting the co-founder agreement in a proper legal form. But they did have good file notes that we could go back to. And that's what we looked at. So the first thing in preparing is go back to your documents, all the things that you've had written down. If you have a co-founder agreement or a shareholders agreement, fantastic. Go back to that, because those documents will give you the starting point on how to deal with an exit. But despite having an agreement, whether or not you have an agreement, your ultimate goal when things go wrong is to negotiate an amicable outcome. And even if you have an agreement, there is always room to negotiate. And that's my position with capital raising, with commercial negotiations generally. There is always a possibility to negotiate a commercial outcome. So how do you actually negotiate an amicable outcome? Now, remember, you need to go into the negotiation with a mindset that you're working side by side with the other person. You're working together, if not together, then at least side by side, to reach a fair agreement that works for both sides. If it's not advantageous to both sides, you're not going to come to an agreement, regardless of how hard you try. So you need to bear that in mind. Second thing to remember is don't argue over positions. Now, I'll give you an example of what arguing or bargaining over positions looks like. So Sophie would say, we agreed that I would get 30% of the equity, so that's what I expect to receive when I'm leaving. Alex would respond by saying, no, you haven't achieved your milestones, we're not giving you anything. So Sophie wants her equity, Alex says no equity. Sophie would then respond, if you don't give me what was agreed, I'll sue you. She's digging in her heels, and Alex digs her heels in and says, no way, go ahead. There's no way you'll get a single share. So as you can see, it develops into a battle of wills, and the parties get locked into their positions the more they negotiate. So they're digging their heels in, they're not going anywhere, and they need to meet in the middle or somewhere between their positions in order to reach an outcome. So what do you do in a negotiation? You focus on interests, not positions. So a position is the outcome that you've decided on, whereas an interest is what motivates someone. So your interests are the reasons for your position. For example, Alex's interest is that she doesn't want to give someone shares, or she doesn't want someone to keep shares if they leave the business. So Alex's interest is she's worked in the business for close to 2 years for sweat equity, and she wants to ensure that future employees and investors are prioritized over someone who's no longer in the business. Whereas from Sophie's perspective, she's worked in the business for 12 months for no pay. She's contributed, things just haven't worked out because it's a difficult business to be in. So the problem then becomes, between the two of them, how do you remunerate Sophie for the work that she's done, because she says that she's contributed? How do you remunerate her without putting the startup in a position that makes it difficult for them to grow in future and to raise capital in future, which was Alex's position? So you see how we reframed the problem into a problem about meeting common interests rather than positions. So in the end, what we negotiated was a position where Sophie would paid out a small lump sum, plus if the company earned a certain amount of revenue over time, we would pay her additional amounts to remunerate her fairly for the amount of work that she'd put in. We also promptly put in place a co-founder agreement between Alex and Adam. Now, we teach you these negotiation skills in our masterclass. So if you're interested, we can go into more of the principles in the masterclass itself. So that is the main part of my presentation I wanted to talk to you about today. before we go, there are a few things we wanted to run through with you. The first is a quiz. And as I said at the beginning, the winner will win a ticket to our masterclass. There are two types of tickets to the masterclass. One is for the masterclass and one is for the masterclass plus a term sheet. So the winner of this quiz will get a ticket to the masterclass without the term sheet. And the question is this, and Tony is going to post it on our Facebook page, and I'd like you to drop your answer in there. What are 3 qualities to consider when vetting a co-founder? What are 3 qualities to consider when vetting a co-founder? So the winner will be picked shortly by me. So what I'll do is once we start getting answers on there, I'll pick a number and we'll see whether the person at that number will have the right answer. So let me stop sharing my screen and jump onto Facebook.
Yeah, hi everyone. So the link that I sent through earlier, the Facebook link, the questions will be there. So what you need to do when you're on the link, you just scroll down, you'll see 3 questions. It actually starts off with question 3, and then you scroll down and go question 2, and then finally it'll be question 1. Yeah, so just answer in the comment section below question 1, and let me know if there's any issues or anything.
So it's the post that says Co-founder Magic Webinar Quiz. Know the answer, drop it here. So if you know the answer, what are 3 qualities to consider when vetting a co-founder? Anyone going to have a go? All right, Matt, great. Got one answer. I won't look at that because I'm going to pick a number. So once we've got a few people on there, let me know, Tony, and I'll pick a number. I can't hear you, Tony.
Sorry, I was on mute the whole time. We've got 2 so far. We've got one from Matt and one from Louise.
Right. Don't tell me the order that they're in because I'm going to have to pick a number. Thanks, Tim. Thanks, Artem. All right, I think we'll pick a number. How many responses do we have, Tony?
We have 4.
4 responses. Okay, let's go with 1 and see whether or not the fastest fingers got the answer right. So
Yep.
So you want to tell me what
we'll read it out. Yep.
Yep. So who was it? And
so
what was their answer?
It was from Matt Jenkins. Thank you so much, Matt. His response is complementary skills and background, number 1. Number 2 is similar work ethic. And then number 3 is personality fit.
Yeah, absolutely. So well done. Well done, Nat. So we'll be in touch with you after the session today with your free ticket. And also we've got 2 more questions which we'd like your answer to, and we'll be giving away for these 2 tickets. We're actually giving away the first question. We'll be giving away a ticket to the masterclass without the term sheet. And the question is this: what is one thing you've learned today that you'll action? And the second question, and you'll see these in the separate posts on Facebook, is what would you like to hear about next? And the winner of that question will be the person that gets the most likes. And that person will get a ticket to the masterclass plus an investor ready term sheet. So put your answers down, write down your answers, ask your colleagues and your friends to like it. And the person with the most likes on the question, what would you like to hear about next, will win a ticket to the masterclass with a term sheet. And the person whose answer we like the most on what is one thing you've learned today that you'll action, get a free ticket to the masterclass. So thanks very much for that. Great. So our masterclass negotiation, if you sign up in the next 24 hours and use the code co-founder, you can get tickets for $99 instead of the usual $499. And co-founder TS, you get a ticket $599 rather than $1,499. And that's the masterclass plus a term sheet. And that's a half-day masterclass where you learn all the ins and outs of term sheets and how to negotiate them. And the negotiation skills really you can apply to any part of your business. And we do have a few minutes left to answer questions. If anyone has questions, please pop them in the chat. Otherwise, you can connect with me on our Term Sheet Guru Facebook page, the Raise podcast, where we talk to founders about their capital raising journey. I've also dabbling in TikTok with some very bad acting. So join me on there as well. Otherwise, do drop any questions that you have into the chat. The course is online, Artem, in the current format that we have, similar to this. But we do have breakout groups. So what we do is the negotiation skills that we run through with you, we have breakout groups where you go in pairs and you actually negotiate parts of the term sheet with other people. At the moment, it's on a weekday, but of course, if you can't attend a weekday and you prefer a weekend, it's something that we're open to considering. Nikolai, great question. Thank you, Hunter. Nikolai's question is, you talked about assigning equity based on skills, etc. How do you approach it when one founder brings money in the business and the other doesn't? You approach it in exactly the same way. And in the sense that you need to work out how much equity you assign to a particular amount of money that's put in. And the way that you do that is you need to think about valuing the business. And again, it's just another category on your scorecard that says for this much financial contribution, you get this much equity. Now, the only difference with financial contribution is that arguably, to be fair, if someone has put money into the business, then that part of equity that they get for the money should not have to vest. So if, for example, your co-founder has put in $50,000 and you say that that equals 1% of equity, because that money has gone into the business, a fair position would be that that 1% already vests and you don't lose that 1% if they leave. Thanks, Hunter. Any other questions? Thanks, Nikolai. Okay, great. I think that looks like it. We've still got a few people hanging around, but if you have any more questions, post it up onto the Facebook page or contact me on email. Happy to have a chat. Thank you very much for joining me today. Good luck with your ventures. I look forward to hearing about it, and join us for our next webinar next month. Thank you, everyone. Good afternoon.